So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which both Nikos and I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we'd both like to extend and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And we'd also like to acknowledge the many unrecognised queer Indigenous histories and lineages as well. So yeah, thank you so much for having us. Really excited to be here, and hi everyone at home. I guess yeah, as Julia said, we're going to be talking about the two bodies of work that Nikos has in Friendship as a Way of Life. And I've just seen myself documentation of the show, and I'm envious that I'm not in Sydney to see it because it looks really incredible. So I guess just as a little intro to Nikos and my kind of working relationship, we've done a number of projects together over the last sort of 6 years or so. I worked with him on a project at a small gallery that I ran called Dud Space, which was literally a corridor on the way to the toilet, where we developed the private view and occasional performance, which has some of the works that are in the show in Sydney at UNSW, and sort of from that point we've also sort of worked on shows for Sydney Contemporary, and then more recently as part of a group show that I worked on called Queer Economies. So yeah, we have a kind of long history. Anyway, sorry, I'm blabbing now, but I guess we're going to start with talking about Dark Rooms. So I wanted to ask Nick if maybe you could talk a bit about that project, and also how the works were made, and also what the motivation was.
The works started to develop out of a way of me kind of like trying to trace a history, my own kind of history of places that I went to in order to make sense and make a recognition of the places that I went to kind of form my own understanding of my own gayness, I guess. So I did this kind of like tracing and found that a lot of these private places in which I wanted to engage with other men, the male gender, I guess, or to be gay, were in these kind of private spaces. And as I tried to retrace them and find them, I noticed that I developed this desire not only in trying to engage men, but also in the interior architecture. And I was really kind of engrossed in that. And so I wanted to find a way of capturing them. And then as I did that, and I started to document them, I also recognized that they were starting to vanish themselves. So that project of documenting interior architecture became a kind of pressing thing for me, and kind of important, because I recognized there was a big kind of relationship with a lot of gay men or queer people who were interested in kind of these modernist forms, and they were appearing in these spaces, and I thought there was a very interesting connection to coming together beyond just the sexuality.
And so in the UNSW's gallery show, there's 3 images from the series. How many images are there in total, and what, what do they entail, or what are the sort of focal points? And also, I guess I'm interested, sorry, I'm asking like 30 questions in one, but I'm interested also in how you found these sites. Were they sites that you already knew existed, or did you seek them out?
There's literally like hundreds of these interiors, but there's only materially as a pigment print in frames probably about 30. But I literally found them out because they are places that once existed. The ones that are shown there, there's only one that still exists, and that's the one in the middle. Whereas Club 80 is only recently just closed, and that's Untitled Man on Horse, and Untitled Spa closed in 2012. That's Kens of Kensington, and that was in Sydney. So Untitled Man on Horse was Club 80. That was a venue that started in Sydney in the 70s and then was kicked out of the suburbs of Sydney somewhere, and they relocated to Melbourne, and they moved to Collingwood, and they opened and existed as a venue for some 20 to 30 years, 40 years maybe, but have been closed down due to gentrification. And the same thing happened with Kens of Kensington, although that opened in 1936, or sometime very early, called the Purple Onion. And the one in the centre is Wet on Wellington. I don't really like to disclose the name of the place that still exists, but the reality is that it's there, but it's not functioning at the moment due to COVID-19.
And I mean, I guess, you know, to me, a really interesting aspect about dark rooms is this kind of notion of disclosure. And in some ways, you know, what happens through your act of kind of like, you know, exposing them or showing these sites. Like, I'm interested in what that kind of tension is, because obviously these are sites predominantly that are or have been for, you know, queer or gay men. How do you think the site kind of functions when you then photograph it and disseminate the imagery, or where do you see yourself there in that kind of space?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to do as an artist is that I'm trying to find the desire in the architecture, which is underpinning like a queer desire, but I'm trying to do it with interior design. So I'm trying to photograph spaces that kind of exist, that I think are kind of sexy, and they're sexy to everyone, but in some way they're kind of like made to be sexy for a particular type of community.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely comes through obviously very clearly with the columns. I mean, I think it's a very interesting kind of genre that is probably not very, you know, discussed, and is something that your work definitely highlights, which is the interior architecture of these sites and how unique they are, and how they kind of straddle this line between aesthetic and utility. You know, particularly the spa image. You know, I've always loved that, because it has, you know, in the foreground you have this incredible kind of like, you know, the phallic handrail that kind of like is almost extending from kind of below, but it's, yeah, and it's like the kind of high chrome. It's very of its time, and yeah, the aesthetic is really kind of fascinating. I don't know, when you were saying about your fascination with it, I couldn't help but kind of have this like thought in the back of my mind of you visiting these sites or something, and your kind of mind wandering off and like, you know, looking at the ceiling, or, you know, like kind of observing, yeah, the kind of physical, because none of the images that in dark rooms have people in them either, do they? No. Was that a conscious sort of decision for you?
Very much so, yes, very much, because I think the whole reason why I go to those places, or I went to those places, I don't go to those places anymore because they don't really exist, but they were places that I went to. The whole reason why I went to, because I felt alone or lonely, and I was there to maybe connect, but quite often or not, that connection doesn't really happen. And so you find yourself kind of like sitting in a room, kind of staring at space, and then you start wondering about what that space is like, and then you are kind of like you over-articulate the space, and the space becomes more the relationship that you create rather than maybe having an encounter, because the encounter doesn't happen, or very rarely happens, if at all.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, I guess because a lot of the sites that you've documented have obviously closed down, do you think that then changes their function from being something that is, you know, kind of highlighting or exposing these kind of hidden sites that most people don't know about, and kind of almost like transforming them into kind of historical documentation and or educational kind of images, like to kind of, you know, mark the history of these sites, etc.?
I guess so. I guess so. That was never really truly the intention, but I think it sort of becomes that. For me, the intention was to get back in there and really have and photograph it as a space of desire, because this is like almost 2013. But then when I started photographing them that way, yeah, I think you're right. I started to see that was those were the places where I learned who I was. That's why I discovered like what I do. Like they were my intimate conversations with a few people that I did meet. That's where I made my intimate conversations. Being gay wasn't as like conversation. It was not. I don't even know if it is now, but it wasn't conversational then. It's not like an easy conversation anyway.
And I guess maybe we could have or think about the kind of performative aspect as well. I think that's a really interesting part, and to me, it's like the kind of companion, or that's like the second part of that actually really makes this work have a real kind of oomph. And yeah, there's an image up here. So this was just as a brief intro, was private view and occasional performance. That's right, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah.
Yeah. At Dud Space in 2014 or 13. And the notion was there was a very small, quite a tiny gallery space in Dud Space that was probably quite similar size to like a toilet cubicle or something. It was pretty inaccessible. And for this work, we presented, I think, the full suite of Darkroom's images, sort of as if they were in storage, sort of sitting on shocks and leaning against the wall in this tiny little cupboard space. And then intermittently throughout the exhibition, there were a series of performers that that came in. I think a lot were your students at the time from RMIT that were roped in to come in a kind of processional manner and carry the works out wearing white handling gloves. And they were paraded around or through King's artist run space, because Dud Space was running out of King's, and then they were brought down onto the street and kind of held for the public to see along King Street. So this, in a way, was the kind of secondary component, right, to the project. Did you want to sort of talk about what or why this performative aspect kind of came out, or what your thinking was?
Yeah, I think you invited me to kind of like participate in your program, and I was really excited about this kind of idea of working in a really tiny space. And I think when I initially saw the space, it was something that appeared to be what you would think of as a sculptural space, something that you kind of like put into the center of that very tiny space, and people would kind of negotiate their bodies through the entrance and somehow negotiate themselves around an object potentially, or something plastered onto the wall in that room, and then leave the space. And when I first saw it, I was interested in this idea of compression, and what would it be to compress an exhibition and put it in there, and then find a way of kind of stretching it out. And so I think our conversation started where you were trying to work out which works would work within that space, and then I wanted to actually show the whole show that was in the project room. So then we came to this kind of like great conversation that was all about finding a way to compress the whole exhibition onto these chocks that you just mentioned, leaning up against the wall, and then to develop this kind of like roster where the work would stretch back out and leave Dud Space and enter King's, and then onto King Street, and then become this kind of like stretched out exhibition, and then would then once again return. So I think you single-handedly like increased our visitation like 1,000-fold. I think when we were talking about it, I loved the fact that it was really taking out of this really niche kind of space, like a niche within a niche, an artist-run space within an artist-run space, and your desire to actually bring the works out onto the street and like have, I guess it's like almost like this kind of active public exposure for the works. And I do remember when the processions were taking place, the responses from people going past were pretty funny. Like, people would toot, or people would be confused, or I remember, definitely some people would kind of like come and actually have a look and stop and try and come in front. And it was a really, amazing way to, I guess, like physicalize as well these these kind of two-dimensional or framed photographic images, and give like a kind of vitality or additional kind of meaning to them. And I remember you also talking about the kind of procession in some ways, obviously the context of King Street, and
at the time, this notion of like bringing the works onto the street was almost like this act of solidarity. What and how did that work, do you think?
Well, I initially remember King Street as being a place that I went to very young to kind of like explore nightclubbing culture. But when the work arrived and the work was in King Street, and I was in your gallery that was on King Street, I was thinking very much about the other types of businesses that exist and the other kinds of organisations, and how although it's this kind of like inner city pocket of vibrant culture, there's a lot of minority groups like sex workers that exist, or sex clubs and nightclubs that exist in that kind of space. And I was really interested in engaging that kind of community that kind of operates in this minority space. And I wanted that the queerness to come out as the work came out, to then kind of touch on the queer other types of minority cultures that may not be gay or part of that culture, but somehow intersect, like the sex workers.
Yeah, cool. And just while we've got the image up as well, do you want to just briefly maybe just mention what those three images are? Because I think it's quite interesting. Yeah.
So that the black image is part of a wall at Club 80 that actually the nightclub Trough operates in. Operated in when it was at Club 80. That's just a piece of a wall, and that's where people kind of, if you look up close to it, it's where people kind of lean their feet up against kind of the wall as they rest or they do things. The center image is a disco ball in a club that still operates, that's in actually the Mornington Peninsula of Melbourne, and that's a queer club in its truest sense, in that it operates for a very mixed community in the outskirts of Victoria. And the golden vase is from Wedon Wellington. It's just this kind of niche area in the space where there's this vase that people walk past that I'm sure nobody looks at and even knows exists.
Yeah, cool. And I mean, we were talking earlier as well about yeah, and I think you kind of touched on the notion that, like, you know, there's been a kind of seismic shift in terms of these kind of queer or gay architectural spaces and kind of venues, and that, you know, they're progressively closed down over the years. And that, I guess, yeah, digital technologies in some ways, through apps like Grindr, etc., have kind of taken over the way people maybe interact and hook up or connect, etc. Do you think that, you know, given the current kind of you know, COVID crisis, etc., that we're going to see, like, you know, ripple effects or, like, you know, more kind of closures, etc., of some of the remaining spaces?
I don't know if we're going to see closure. I'd hate to, but I know that, like everything else, everything's been extended out to be a slower opening up. But I think in general there's a decline in people wanting to meet in these public-private spaces pre-COVID, but also I'm sure COVID's made it even more intensely something that people won't enter into, and that online occupation is probably going to be a much bigger occupation, material occupation.
And I think, yeah, something else we touched on earlier was in terms of the material, you seem to be very drawn to material process, and it's something that, you know, you have since, you know, even from sort of dark rooms to now, is a really central part of your work. Why is that, or what is it that has you so materially focused? Sorry, is that a terrible question?
No, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. I guess I feel that I want to make a claim that the image is material, and I really did it in a very kind of blind way, trying to understand how materially an image is kind of like produced. And that it comes from a sculptural space, and then it still maybe remains into a sculptural space, but it kind of maybe potentially kind of engages more materials than the idea that sculpture might. Mm-hmm. And there's this kind of like argument in the arts that photography took a very long time to be engaged into this form, and that sculpture and painting exists in this much more kind of opulent, higher up space. And I wanted to challenge that because I felt very much through my academic learnings how dominant the other art forms were, to a point where I found it almost toxic, actually. So that I felt this very important kind of desire to want to make the image exists in the material space.
Yeah, cool. And I guess, you know, for those who don't or aren't familiar with your more recent work, you know, you now make most of or all of the frames in your photographic work yourself, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, we should probably go on to the next work as well that's included in the show. Oh, actually, yeah. Did you want to touch on these as well, Nick? Still, I think we've got time, haven't we? Yeah. This was just, I guess, you know, as a way of introduction, this is just this is actually me holding I think a Paul Adair work as part of these economies at Sydney Contemporary. And yeah, for this project, I guess, like Nick and I, we worked together to make this installation where works were kind of contained within this kind of zone. And in a similar way to the Dud Space project, works were kind of, you know, taken out of that space and kind of taken around the art fair. So you're looking at me with a funny expression, Nick. Was that right? Am I describing it? No. Okay. No. And I guess for me, it was like this interesting project in kind of building on dark rooms and obviously functioning in a very different space in a, you know, the context of an art fair where most of the works are contained within discrete, you know, kind of temporary architectural walls. And I think, you know, yeah, this was quite an interesting project because we really kind of broke out of that and kind of took the works around, going in front of the blue chip galleries, etc. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that project, Nick, in terms of how it fits within maybe a lineage of iterations with dark rooms?
That project is called These Economies, which is kind of like different to dark rooms that was called Private View and Occasional Performance. So These Economies was thinking about my work entering into like an art fair, and how my work would potentially engage an art fair. Well, not only my work, the kind of curatorial premise would engage an art fair, and how if I continued in this kind of way of the work leaving a compressed space and moving through a site, how the work engages other public or the public. So I was interested in that kind of like, in that movement, that the procession becomes this performance that speaks to the art fair. But I wanted to also do it in this in a social value, and I was thinking about how the procession or the performance is very much this kind of like class system, or this thing that happens in a particular kind of community, like at a market stall potentially, or in a public space where you're trying to engage in a less opulent kind of way than a blue chip gallery.
And it makes me think as well, you know, that both to the Sydney Contemporary and also the Dud Space project, you know, both of them were kind of provocations to the kind of site or zone, you know, like on the street, obviously on King Street, which is a busy thoroughfare, not usually a place where, you know, kind of precious works of art would be, you know, shown or on display. And similarly with the, yeah, with Sydney Contemporary, in the way that, yeah, there was like almost a degree of danger or some kind of, yeah, kind of, you know, way of approaching it that was almost transgressive or something to what the kind of regular approach would be. And then we've also now got an image as well of the second part of private view and occasional performance, which was at NGV, wasn't it? Do you want to talk about that one maybe briefly in terms of and sort of bringing them through the various sites of the NGV and how that worked?
This whole project became more a thing about the act of solidarity, in that I really wanted the work to either stand beside or to block a particular kind of narrative. So the work begun in the David McDermott retrospective, which is on the top floor of the NGV and Ian Potter. And I wanted the performance that actually were like re-choreographed. A lot of these performers had already performed in, well, they're actually participants, not performers. These participants had already, many of them had already participated in in private view and occasional performance at Dud Space, and they were kind of returning to this to the NGV as a site, and so understood the idea of picking up the work and then moving through the space and thinking about how the work operated to a public. And I wanted them to kind of like respond to the exhibition that they were walking through. So when they walked through the feminist exhibition on the second floor, they were standing beside the work, and when they were walking through the painting exhibition on the first floor, about Australian history, I wanted them to block the work and think about decolonisation. And then when I was standing beside the Indigenous work, I wanted them to actually stand in a circle beside the Indigenous work and think in terms of acts of solidarity. So the work operated as this queer work that would engage or block or do something in response to the site or the exhibition they were standing beside.
So it's almost like a kind of queer infiltration or something that starts like, it's dialogical, not necessarily like trying to erase other histories, but like kind of create tension alongside or something.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
And maybe we could talk now about the other part of the second work that you have in the show at UMSW, which is called How to Make a Monument, also from 2013. Now this work is a sort of scale model and a range of other elements, which sort of focuses on this really kind of important architectural building that was in Fitzroy Gardens. That's a toilet block. Could you maybe give the audience a brief introduction to the significance of this site and what kind of transpired?
Whilst I was making these photographs of for darkrooms of sites in Victoria and New South Wales that have been that exist or are vanishing, that are kind of in that in-between space, in the private and public space. And I'd started making conversations with people about the work that I was doing. I was told about this particular site in the Fitzroy Gardens that used to exist, that was built in 1956, that was demolished in 2006. And I was told about it being a kind of this site that had a lot of gay activity on it, and it was demolished. And I was very curious to find out about it, because I had never actually really visited it in the same kind of way as I'd visited all the other sites. So I really wanted to know about it and did this kind of like research. And I was told about other artists that had made photos of it and paintings, and somehow started to make this kind of connection to all these other artists. And through that kind of connection, I ended up going to the Melbourne City Council and getting the plans for this building that used to exist, and worked with an architect to rebuild it at a much smaller scale, and rebuilt it and then photographed it and then made these kind of like very simplistic drawings. And I was thinking very much about how to kind of reimagine a site that had vanished. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, cool. And I guess like, because this was obviously part of your PhD project, or this was your PhD. it's like we were talking about it earlier, and you kind of explained all of the kind of discrete elements that kind of come together. Would you mind talking about that? Because I think it's really fascinating to hear. I guess, you know, for me, it's like it's such a rigorous project. Yeah, I find it really interesting.
I'm trying to say, architecturally, like I was very, when I researched this site and when I was trying to find out about this site, I was very interested in how architectural this was quite an amazing space. Interiorly, it had this public-private thing in very much the same way as these photographs that I had been photographing had. Only it operated in a much more kind of public domain, and it was something that you could kind of access in a much easier way than you could all these interior spaces. And then because it didn't exist, it only existed as photographs from other people and as paintings by other artists. I wanted to reimagine it myself. I wanted to somehow kind of claim part of this kind of history, I guess. So having to trace the steps of where the building once was and then try to remake it, I felt I could connect to it in a much closer way. So then I would like rebuild it. So I found a way to rebuild it. And the only way I knew how to rebuild it was actually by making these drawings and then working with an architect to make them, put them into a laser cutter and then get them all laser cut and then remake it as a model. And then I started to feel this kind of like direct relationship to what the actual building may have been. And from there, I was very interested in how it became an educational space for me, because although I'd never really visited it, I was kind of like became engaged in this space that I knew there was a lot of queer and minority experiences happening in it. And because of the architecture of the space, it also kind of lends an even bigger kind of history, because it had these kind of walls that people could walk in and out of, and it was free flowing and had this kind of like very fluid aesthetic. Became meaningful to me as an architectural symbol of queerness, and I was really shocked that it was demolished without consultation, as the architectural community in Victoria were. So
and that was because the local community like didn't want it to be there. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the East Melbourne community didn't want it, and they petitioned for it to be torn down, and there was no consultation, and it was taken down whilst the architectural and queer community were kind of like devastated and kind of like fought to try and keep it going, but it was taken down.
Yeah, right. And just on this image as well, obviously part of it is the photograph at the back, and then obviously we've got the model, and in the foreground, what's that? What's the kind of book work there? What does that entail?
That's all the information that I kind of gathered trying to put together the puzzle about what the history of that place was. There's also there's also a cardboard model that I made of the space before I accessed the architectural drawings. I tried to make it out of cardboard, and that was shown in Unmack. That's an Magazine artist page, but it's also along the bottom of that was just things that I remembered about educational information, about trying to piece together coming out or being gay, alongside this history of one particular place of a building that was erected and then demolished.
So it's kind of like a combination of, like, you know, factual and personal histories or something together. Yeah.
It's actually all factual. It's just that one page there that's personal.
Okay. And also maybe the last thing I just wanted to ask about this is as well what I love about that you have as well, like a kind of a takeaway paper template that people can actually create their own monument out of paper. Yeah, which is this on the shelf. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting thing in terms of putting the onus or allowing the audience to kind of create or form their own histories, which is obviously something so integral to a lot of these kind of queer spaces that they were kind of claimed as queer spaces. What was the kind of impetus there with that kind of template?
I wanted to kind of like image that building. But when I got the architectural drawings, I found them really dense and very hard to read. But I'd made that cardboard model that you'd seen, and I wanted to image it in a kind of flat way, in a way that would be part of a book, and not necessarily so transparent as the photograph, but lent itself to kind of lead its way into being a photograph. And I also wanted it to be like a DIY thing. So I kind of flattened out that architectural space in a easy to understand formula, so that you can cut it up and remake it as your own kind of thing. And I wanted it to be this kind of light memento to the space.
Yeah. And to me it seems almost, I'm thinking about dark rooms as well, and the kind of performances. It's interesting, it's a kind of similar but different kind of democratization or something of the artwork, where with the performances it's kind of bringing the work onto the street, or out of whatever the kind of set context is, and kind of disregarding that. And similarly with the monument, it's like this kind of like allowing an audience to rebuild or to reconsider how that functions, or what the history of that that is. So yeah. Should we go into question time, or is there anything else you wanted to say about that work, Nick?
Not particularly, no. Just with that artist book, the way it's exhibited in this exhibition, which is actually absolutely beautiful, and there's a lot more. There's an elevation to the book, whereas when I showed it and when I was thinking about it, I wanted it to be a little bit more quiet, because I remember reading a lot about Felix Gonzalez-Torres and him using these kind of like takeaway works, and they were a little bit dismissed in these biennales and these fairs. People would go to these events and they would take away a poster by Felix Gonzalez-Torres because he's kind of like, really formed that kind of space, and they would walk out and they'd not have anything to, not really know what to do with them, and they'd throw away in the bin. And so when I presented them in a really quiet place, almost out of the way of the exhibition, so that you'd really need to look for it. Although I love this presentation and the way it's been done, I kind of always fear this idea that a work is taken, but it's not really kind of understood or even valued. And not everyone wants to value like a queer architectural space. It's just they may happen to be in the gallery experiencing that. So that elevation of the takeaway is something that I'm not sure how I feel about.
I see. I can understand though, in terms of maybe in previous presentations, having them in a space that people need to kind of engage with. That's quite similar to the notion of like a lot of the kind of queer sites that you kind of need to, in some ways, be initiated into, or have some kind of drive to kind of participate in anyway. So I mean, thinking about that kind of parallel, it makes a lot of sense to me. Cool. Should we open up the floor to questions and stuff then?
We do have a few questions already, which is great. So the first one is really looking back at dark rooms, and they ask, were any of the venue managers reticent to have you document the premises?
No, actually all the venue managers were very accommodating and happy to help. But I will say that all the venue managers invited me once the cleaners had been there. So but I was very happy for that. That's what I wanted. So
good to know. The second question we have is also about darkrooms. Will you do a similar performance in Sydney with the Darkroom series?
Maybe, but there's nothing planned for it at the moment.
Okay. Moving on to the next question. This person writes, thank you for sharing this background to your Darkroom series. Could you talk a little bit more about your interest in less obvious images like the vase and the more direct interiors like the spa or the movie theatre?
Yeah, I sort of like touched on that earlier, but that's actually a really important question, like, because those less direct things are the things that kind of like drove the whole project, in that you kind of like enter these architectural spaces and you're thinking about more kind of like grandiose experiences that might take place. Like, I'm going to a gay venue because I'm going to get off, or I'm going to meet the person of my dreams, or I'm going to have this amazing experience. But then you're kind of like left alone and you're on your own in this interior space because there's not really that much that is happening. There may be other bodies around, but those other bodies are probably feeling in the same kind of like place as you. So then you start kind of like focusing on those kind of like absent spaces, and then you start finding desire in the architecture or in the interior. And that became the driving force to the whole project, really, that I was more interested in these kind of like empty interiors, because that was what I was identifying with.
Fantastic. And then we have one, actually we do have a couple more questions, but the next question is about how to build a monument. And this person's asked, who designed the Melbourne toilet block, or do you have more information about yeah, the architectural history there?
It's penned. It's penned that it's said that the building is designed by Roy Grounds, but the building was commissioned by the Melbourne City Council and was built by the Melbourne City Council, and he may have signed off on it, but the actual he may have designed it, but it was the Melbourne City Council that actually signed off on it. So people say that it's a Roy Grounds building, but in the architectural drawings, it doesn't actually say Roy Grounds. So it's kind of like this public space designed by the Melbourne City Council that's been potentially led by Roy Grounds.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I think you did sort of cover this next question in the talk a little bit, but maybe if you can expand on why the community wanted the toilet block demolished, or parts of the community wanted the toilet block demolished.
So it's built on the edges of a really beautiful garden in Melbourne, Fitzroy Gardens, and so these gardens separate the inner city to this very bougie neighbourhood called East Melbourne. So there's lots of beautiful buildings, and also with Parliament, it also separates. There's Parliament, the city, and East Melbourne, and there's these really gorgeous gardens. So this building is built inside these gardens, and on the side of the East Melbourne community is a lot of private residencies, and these private residencies were kind of bothered by the people that would spend time loitering around this canopy, because this building is built by this open canopy. So there was lots of hanging out by misfits, gay people and homeless people. There were a lot of homeless people too, and they would use it as a homeless shelter. And it didn't look good, and it wasn't very comfortable for the people in the East Melbourne community to have all these people underneath this canopy, kind of like a nightly kind of like turnover. So this kind of architecture was very unsavoury to the East Melbourne community and to Parliament, and that's all kind of like per chance, I guess. So they had to get rid of it because it just offered too much of an opportunity.
Fantastic. Yes, that does make it much clearer. We do have one final question that's come through. And thinking about Felix Gonzalez Torres, historically, are there other artists, queer or otherwise, that might place your work as adjacent to or as precursors, perhaps? So talking about your influences here. And how do you place the work amongst art history, lineage, and any other artists you gravitate towards?
In terms of the actual procession, there's a few artists that I think about. There's Jeremy Dell that I think a lot about in terms of the way he designs a procession, and Francis Elise. I'd call neither of them as queer artists. I call them both very white, heterosexual males in kind of patriarchal paradigm. But there's also one other artist, and I feel really ashamed I can't remember his surname, but his first name's Fred. He's a black artist, and he made some really great work at the Venice Biennale where he put his work out on a mat, and he tried to sell it as like this, you know, when tourists walk by and there's people selling stuff. And I've just had a complete name blank, but he's on the forefront of, and David Hammond, so two black artists that I think a lot about. They're very important to this kind of like presenting their work to a public that are not really part of the art kind of language. So yeah, so when you think about, when you say queer, I'm not so sure other than Felix, but I would say that Fred and David Hammonds are very important.
Fantastic. And one last question that's snuck through, which is about how you mentioned you were lonely when you were speaking about dark rooms and your engagement with those places. And this person asks, do you know why many LGBTQ people feel lonely and, you know, go to these places that you mentioned to connect? So maybe a bit expanding on dark rooms there.
I don't really know if it's just LGBT. First of all, I just want to say it's Fred Wilson, because I really felt bad that I didn't remember his name, so I had to Google it quickly again. So Fred Wilson's the artist that really kind of matters to me, and David Hammonds. But I'm not really sure that it's exclusive, that being lonely is exclusive to LGBTIQ people. But I'm certain of it. But I would say that there are not that many easy places to access or identify with what that loneliness might be. And, you know, a sense of touch might be a really simple one, or a sense of, you know, just wanting to share an interest. And I'll take it back to a really like cheesy place. When I first met Madé, we were trying to understand how we understood each other in that queer spectrum, and we both felt a little bit kind of like, so what are you into and what are you into? And I'm not going to make it transparent, but within our own conversations, we felt very comfortable. After a series of kind of getting to know each other, we found a way to kind of make transparent to each other what we both felt like we needed to engage with in order to feel connected to something. And I think that was very important to our working relationship, that we found a personal understanding of what it was that we both wanted out of what it meant to be queer. And I don't think that's a really easy thing to do when there's so many peculiarities and particular interests. It's easy to deflect and say that you're into everything, but it's much harder to actually be vulnerable and say I like a particular thing. And I think Madé and I made that happen, and that's why we felt comfortable to work together, because it was very clear about our kind of like what we wanted out of our personal lives, and then what we wanted out of the way we work together. And I don't know how to make that kind of like, without ruining our kind of bond, I don't really know how to make that any more clear.
I just to pipe in, I mean, I'm laughing because it kind of makes you insinuate or sound like, you know, we're in a relationship or something. But skirt around being direct, which is kind of funny. But I mean, I feel like what you're saying is like that, yeah, like through like kind of matching.
I'm talking about codes, aren't I? I'm talking about gay codes.
Yeah, which I guess, you know, these spaces really fit within. And like, I guess, sites where they can be navigated. And I guess you'd say in a similar way, you know, working as artists and curators, we can find those same kind of ways of navigating, you know, in the projects that we do. And I think, yeah, like you and I definitely have been able to like, find a way that we like can be really direct with each other and communicate in a way that, enables things to kind of be easy, you know. And yeah, I mean, I was thinking, you know, obviously, with that question, just to add that as, you know, a queer person, even just in terms of coming out, obviously, part of the challenge is that most of the spaces that we inhabit or one inhabits are actually heteronormative spaces. And I think maybe, that would be my kind of, you know, thinking in terms of why, maybe these sites are important, because they are specifically queer sites that queer people can actually go to feel comfortable and actually connect. Which is also why it's, you know, it's a real shame, even just since you did sort of or photographed and made dark rooms initially, that a lot of these sites have started to close down. I think it is, even though there's been that shift, it's like it is quite a sad and unfortunate thing that these sites no longer exist in the same way as they did, you know.